The content discussed in this episode may be specific to the guest's organisation or location and may not be applicable to other organisations, states, territories or countries. The material presented in this podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be considered health, legal or financial advice. Medical administration is a rewarding profession, but it comes with challenges. So what is it like, and what should you do if confronted with a monumental administrative difficulty? This is the podcast that takes unfortunate scenarios and explores the essentials of clinical governance to find solutions. I'm Dr. David Rankin, a very experienced medical administrator and lead fellow with the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators. And this is Safeguarding Healthcare, the essentials of clinical governance. Today, the ethics of gifts.
Well, in that case, you can give that money to those other hospitals because we're not participating.
That's Dr. Lewis Prado, the Group Director of Medical Services at St John of God Healthcare in Melbourne, and I'm presenting him with a difficult scenario.
If you can't declare what you've had your support or you don't feel comfortable, there's something wrong.
In today's scenario, the hospital is exploring the replacement of its endoscopy equipment. This will involve purchasing 5 new endoscopes, including the towers that hold the light source and camera equipment. There are 2 leading companies that provide the equipment as consideration of the options progress. The head of department expresses a strong preference for one of these companies. On inquiry, it becomes apparent that their partner is a senior executive with their preferred company, and they often enjoy all expenses paid international travel to conferences and training sessions. I started by asking Dr. Lewis Prado what key issues this scenario raises.
The challenge here we've had as specialist medical administrators going back years is indeed the unpeeling of conflict of interest in our profession that goes back, I guess, now decades, and bringing to good governance the how medical profession interacts with other companies and other agencies. Some years ago, the College of GPs had to unpeel this relationship where GPs could be seen to have a conflict of interest because they were sent off to conferences or they were given free professional development. And the college got to the point where it said you can't even have a pen with the name of the drug on the pen when it comes to the college's own meetings. And in fact, there's been a lot of push in terms of the transparency of our profession in where this sort of interaction occurs. You could argue it's got to the point that's almost extreme, but the notion now that a GP could be seen by an objective person to be influenced even down to the level of prescribing, at least it's far more transparent. It's spoken of. There are very strict rules in place, and companies know that. Companies know they can't come to a GP and say, I'll pay for you to go and do this skin conference, or I'll pay for you to go over to this conference about, respiratory tract infections. There are still some murky waters. We still have functions being paid for, lunches being paid for, people come in to talk about their products, but it's a lot more transparent. Years ago, we were having the issues where prosthetics and joint replacements and the association between whether people were using the prosthetic and their own clinical practice and the relationship back to the prosthetic producer was a little bit murky. The same thing applied about stents being used and angioplasties and to what degree cardiologists doing those procedures had any relationship there. And I personally had to deal with a scenario where a significant medical company came to me when I was a medical director in a private hospital and said, we would like to give you money to give to a doctor for them to undertake a conference overseas as a form of fellowship support. And I said, sorry, why are you coming to me? Oh, we can't give it to them directly. I said, well, I'm very happy for you to give me the money, but I'll have a transparent, open process for people to apply to undertake this form of fellowship scholarship, which is the only way. Oh, other hospitals don't do that. Well, in that case, you can give that money to those other hospitals because we're not participating. And I've always had that very strict rule. But, companies have moved around to try and look at ways of circumventing what can be seen as either direct or implied conflict of interest.
So what's the problem? How do conflicts of interest impact on the delivery of healthcare? How is a patient affected by a doctor's conflict?
Well, the interesting thing is, and it applied also through the description of what I said about general practice, is every practitioner that I've met or everything I've read in this topic, I've always maintained there is no conflict. I've never had my clinical practice impacted with my relationship with whichever company that I have. And I find that remarkable. First of all, it says a lot about us as medical professionals that we don't realise, even if we truly believe that ourselves, that the observation of an external person, including our patient, would not be the case. They would not see that because they would not expect that in other industry. Secondly, if it was as transparent as we believe, there should be absolutely no qualms that a doctor says to their patient, by the way, I use this product. I'm going to undertake this equipment for which I get some benefit. And that benefit may not just be money in the bank. It could just be, as we alluded to earlier, support in forms of my professional development. And in the United States, there it is absolutely critical that you must declare every single perceived or known conflict of interest where you get any benefit, absolutely any benefit in terms of your clinical practice to your community, your patients, and to your colleagues. So then the question is, as you said, does it cause a concern? Well, the issue is there's so much trust in place from our patients towards a doctor that even if you declared the conflict, they trust us that this is in fact the best care. They're not informed enough to question, well, hang on, is there actually a better product that you're not affiliated with or a better service that you're not affiliated with that I should be accessing? It's rare that that question is asked because the patients are not educated or informed that they have that opportunity to ask. And that's because in Australia, that trust between patients and doctors, which is very fundamental to our delivery of care, is such that they trust us, that even if we were to tell them, oh, look, I do get some form of benefit by using this prosthetic, or in this case, using this device in gastroenterology, they still trust us and are unlikely to challenge us on it. So that means patients are informed of their rights to know what to ask and to get more information. That's a problem in my view from the outset.
How material does the conflict have to be? You talked about pens for general practitioners, but what about the footy game or the tennis tickets or a dinner when the company's in town?
We've all seen multiple versions of how a company support and produce that support to medical practitioners. The main thing is transparency. That you are potentially supported by a company for a certain thing in itself is not the problem. It could be a problem depending on the nature of the support, but in essence, the issue is declaration of perceived conflict. Coming back from the States, it reminded me how clearly that declaration's done. If you were given tickets to go to the American US Open, you are declaring that, whether you're doing a presentation, whether you're doing it at your surgery or you're in your rooms. You are declaring that to your patients, that this company has support that. You would have it on your website. And so I think we're far from that in Australia. I believe that the fundamental should be if you can't declare what you've had your support or you don't feel comfortable, there's something wrong. Now, it may not be obliged in Australia yet to do that in different forms, but you should be able to do that. And certainly in the interaction between the doctor and the patient, where there is something that's potentially meaningful, not in my eyes, but what would be in their eyes, that should be declared. I would hate to be in a situation after the event where there's been a problem, when the patient finds out that that's the case, even if it's not related to the outcome, it's going to damage the relationship with that patient.
Right. What about the sort of indirect sponsorship? Companies will often set up an education fund that the nurses can get paid conference leave for. How indirect can support be?
I have no issue with donations and fundraising also coming out of private sector, including device companies and medical companies. Absolutely none. And I absolutely like the idea of them putting a hell of a lot of cash into scholarship and education programs. However, just like any other donation, David, it's got to be hands-free. So, companies give money to political parties, and that's all very registered. Companies donate to the Australian Olympics. They do a number of things. It's got to be clear in those scenarios. You give us that money, thank you. We will acknowledge you. It will be provided that this is where it comes from. We will decide who it gets it, how it's given to them, and under what circumstances. And if that doesn't suit, you shouldn't take the money. But I would feel most of the time, if they can get that money and their naming there, they're more than happy to allow the governance to be in your hands. But if they come along and say, oh, this money is to be given to these people by name, or even in a scenario for attending our function, that's not donation. That's just a form of money moving around. I would, as part of that acceptance, have it registered all the way through the gifts registry of our company, declared to the subcommittee of the Board of Risk and Audit, declared to the board, fully transparent, and then, of course, it's acknowledged. At any point, the CEO, whoever, the board says it's too potential conflicted, then it doesn't happen. So I think it's more about making sure you do have that governance in place, whether it's donation to an education fund or to an individual. And in the scenario you painted, the same again.
So what do we do with the Christmas gifts that just arrive on your desk and you look at it and think, whoa, that cost a pretty penny?
Well, I got to tell you, David, I've had that exact scenario a few years back, and the gift itself, the gift policy was, I think, $150, and I Googled the value, and I think it was like $159 at the local bottle shop. And so I declared the gift. I didn't actually know the individual very well, and I didn't like receiving it. So I spoke to both the legal counsel of our organisation and also to the CEO and said, this is an awkward thing. I don't like it. And it breaches the gift policy in terms of it's got to be declared. It's declarable. It was declared. And then I said, I believe that the best approach with this gift, because it was a gift that had to be, it's a consumable gift, was that it would be given under a free raffle in our organisation where our staff could, there's a way you can do it on the internet where everybody has their name, it does a little spin and someone won it. And then we told the person who gave the gift, we went, thank you for your gift. We've registered because it's just over 150. And rather than accepting it directly, what we've done is made it as a part of a free gift raffle for our staff. Somebody won it, and that's what we like you know. The feel was better than returning it, but it was at the $150 mark. I think there's a point, though, where some of them you would go, thank you, and return it. So my view is you're much better to ask people, be very transparent. It's just a bit awkward. What's the best approach? Should we return it? I will declare it anyway. And the feel was, no, well, we'll do this and advise them. And everybody was comfortable rather than me just feeling, oh, isn't this lovely, and sticking into the bottom drawer.
So back to our scenario, it's critically important that the head of department have a voice in which equipment the hospital decides to buy. They've declared their conflict of interest. Do they have to completely step out of the decision process, or can they be involved in the group that decides which is the best equipment?
For me, the critical piece is that having declared the conflict is how it's then managed and who's in charge of the final decision and how that person hears the voice of every participant. I do think they are critical in part as a key stakeholder to be talking about what's necessary. And in fact, there's more power to them if their conflict is being put on the table and it's acknowledged and it's known, and then they can speak with confidence knowing that everyone respects what their position is. Ultimately, though, if they were, for example, the final decision maker, that's flawed governance. If they are a person that isn't the final decision maker, but as the chair, say I am the CMO and chairing this discussion, if I allow that voice to have the only dominant voice, that's on me. Now, it might look good at the end where it goes, oh, it's recommended, but everyone else in that meeting can say, well, we never got a voice. He was the dominant person. His view got there. We were just the pretend members of the committee. So you do need to have that. And if you have doubt, what I recommend doing is, say, for example, for us as RACMA, we might chair that meeting.
Lewis, would you involve an independent person to ensure that the procurement process is transparent and auditable?
Now, you might not get to the point that the state government have with that independent individual there for probity, but you can certainly have a good person from procurement or a good person from finance or a good person from risk and audit, trusted people who go, that doesn't go out well. We don't support it. And who can give you that insight directly to you that the process you're undertaking, despite the declared conflict, is not meeting the governance requirements of the company. So I think that's an important add-on, making sure that I'm in a situation where I know a company, we're actually trying to potentially use that company's product. I've declared that I've known this company, even though I have no financial relationship, for nearly 20 years. And I've kept saying, I know them. So please, everyone, you keep challenging me on them because I know them and they know me. And finally, I tell all doctors, even if they are very aligned to a company, this is in private, we need them to give us that tension in pricing. If they're around sprouting, you're going to get the product because you're the best and I'm there in the meetings, advocating for you, we're not going to get the best price. And I find that doctors love that. They have a private business. They don't mind that if you're going to get the product they like eventually, you're getting it at the best price. So I use that argument as well. Like, if there is not clear tension in the determining of the product, even if at the end of the day we do select that product because it is objectively the best, we still want that company to give us the best price. And if they think they've got to lay down misère, that ain't going to happen. There's no sharpening of the pencil. It's a pragmatic commentary because at the end of the day, you're working with pragmatic doctors who will not understand all the nuances of governance and conflict, but you have to lead them through, keeping in mind that your ultimate responsibilities, in addition to getting the right thing for clinical care, is getting it at the best price you can get as well.
That raises several quite significant issues. The first one is that, the back channel communication that often happens in ignorance as much as in intent, where the organisation, you're involved on the selection committee, and the organisation reaches out and says, look, how are things going? Where are we sitting? This idea that a doctor can provide inside information to negotiation processes is a real fraught issue.
It is. And again, the last two entities I've worked for, the procurement practice is being very well governed, and they're familiar with the notion that specialists particularly can be approached by representatives from different companies, could even be asked, are we in the running? Are we looking good? Who should we speak to? All of those. And again, my view is those doctors need to be within the governance tent. If they aren't, and you go, well, look, they got a conflict, let them out there, they are more likely to create problems without being in the governance tent. But if they're in the procurement process and understand, and we do a lot of, in our processes, a lot of those signing off the confidentiality for procurement, then they're more likely to, and hopefully because of that confidence they have in your system, to appropriately behave and appropriately be part of the procurement process. Whereas if you, in this scenario, was to say, look, you can't be in it, you're in a conflict, and you left them out there and they're not part of it, they're more likely to create problems because they don't actually have any accountability as a private doctor that you can hold them to. So I'm more of the view, bring them in, have a strong procurement process, sign the confidentiality agreements, declare the conflict of interest, involve them, but make sure you manage their input so they're not dominating any discussion, but making it clear from the outset. So fundamentally, in this scenario particularly, I see us as RACMA as our job to look and say, right, is this conflict of interest one that can be managed? We know of it. And is the contribution of this doctor, particularly as a specialist head of unit, critical in the decision-making process? Let's assume the former is that the conflict of interest can be managed, and we talk about that. The latter is they are critical in the selection. If that you find that the conflict of interest is too great and cannot be managed, which I would recommend it's done by discussion with your risk and audit team and or your procurement team, that's the case. However, I do believe having those doctors in this scenario, where possible, within the organisation governance in determining the procurement is a much better way if you can manage. And ideally, the process would be you would have them as part of the procurement process in your company, and I would recommend to every RACMA be very clear in the understanding in your company what that procurement process is and how the conflict is managed. To have there the signed confidentiality agreements, an explanation of the probity required of those doctors as part of the decision making and part of, say, the committee that will be doing this. you yourself or someone independent, like from procurement, chairing that meeting, ensuring that all stakeholders have equal opportunity to make their point, and that that person or other people declaring the conflict are not allowed to, by default or strength of character, or in this case, positional authority as head of the department, drive the decision making, and then you end up with the decision they wanted, but everyone else feeling disconnected. That's critical. Have on that procurement someone who's not from that clinical sphere, but understands probity, understands good governance, and understands the procurement to test you, say you are the chair, to ensure that a conflict of interest and how that discussion's occurred and that transparency has occurred in those meetings. So you have that level of comfort and trusted that despite the confidentiality agreement and discussion of probity and discussion of conflict of interest, you haven't still had a flawed process, because all in good intentions, it didn't work. Now, you may or may not chair that. Again, that would depend on your own organisational governance. But if you are part of that process, you would make sure that's in place. If, for example, though, you weren't, so say you aren't going to be part of the procurement process directly, but you are aware of all this as the CMO of RACMA, and it may be that you can't be at all those procurement meetings, then what I would do is specifically take the points I've just made, go to the procurement team, the leader of that group, and say, look, I'm not on the procurement, but we will have a conflict of interest declared, tick. We will have a confidentiality process, ticked. We'll have an explanation to all the practitioners about the importance of keeping the discussion confidential, and tick. The chair of that meeting, whoever that is, needs to understand that these individuals, who are very important and powerful clinicians in their own mind, but also to us, can dominate. So be conscious of allowing everyone to have their say, ensure that everybody has capacity to make their points, and ensure that you don't have an unintended railroaded decision, particularly if you can't chair or be present. You might have someone from your team that can, you might have a deputy that can, you might have a trusted other person within your own medical admin team. But if not, and I'm being very pragmatic, it can't be everywhere, then in those scenarios, you state that, and then you welcome that if there are any concerns, and if the meeting does get derailed, because this could happen, that the chair pauses it and says, right, well, look, I will need to stop here, and as an action, I will be consulting with the chief medical officer or the RACMA, whoever you are, because I want to get clarity as we're going to progress. And in that case, you may, in fact, come along to see how you can assist to ensure good governance. I would also make sure your procurement team, this is again when you're not involved directly, are very across all the nuances. I have a great relationship with procurement where I am, where they go even down to IV fluids. Who do we need to talk to? Who should we involve? Who do we need to involve and engage at the outset? And to inform them so that they feel confident they're making the right call for the organisation as well.
That was Dr. Lewis Prado, the Group Director of Medical Services at St John of God Healthcare in Melbourne. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Safeguarding Healthcare. I'm Dr. David Rankin. Follow Safeguarding Healthcare free on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This podcast is produced by Sound Cartel for the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators.